Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
And I'm your other host, Stephen Falgu. Get Recc'd is our fortnightly podcast
Louis
where
Falgout.
every week I recommend something to Louis recommends something to me, and then we discuss those recommendations. Today is the wrap up of wrap up in that our recommendation today will be the end of our three-part series where we're looking back as we've now hit into the 30s of episodes, looking back at some of our past recommendations and giving recommendations related to some of those. So today we'll be looking at some Pink Floyd, some Vampire Weekend, which Louis and I have recommended to each other before.
Yeah, I do think that we need to clarify a little bit just in case it was confusing. So what Stephen was saying was that the recommendations at the end of today's episode are the final re-rec. So the next Get Recc'd episode will be the final re-rec episode. Okay, cool. Okay, yeah. But yes, that's true. And
Yeah,
in
I
fact,
misspoke there. Technically, next episode is the wrap up, but this episode's Rex today
yeah,
will be the last of this
it's the
series.
beginning of the end, if you will. And now I think the plan is, or at least my idea was, maybe I'm throwing this one on Steven super late. He didn't even know. Oh shit! But my idea was that re-rec will be a continuous thing, but we'll do it. I don't know. I guess we can do it every 30 episodes now that we did it on episode 30. I guess it doesn't really matter. But it just gives us a chance to kind of go back and reflect on other things and kind of look at other things, especially in cases where one of us might feel like we didn't recommend the right thing. From any particular or whatever the case may be, right? Okay. So
And some people out there might be asking, wow, you guys are expecting to have another 30 episodes? I do want to stress, we are stuck in this prison. We cannot escape.
yeah, we
Whether
have been
you will,
trying for this entire time. You guys don't even know. This has been a cry for help from the fucking beginning, and none of you listened. Which
and whether and to be clear, whether you listen to our podcast or not, we will still have to do this podcast. It's been mandated. It's thanks to our corporate sponsors.
yeah. Which, of course, we share our utmost gratitude and servitude towards and do not wish any ill will towards. Oh, please, God, help us and remove us from this eternal coil. Anyway.
And Louis, I like how you noted servitude because really,
Yeah, really, we are the exploited proletarians in this situation. Anyway. Okay.
which we'll talk about later. Okay, but
Ooh! I love it when that happens.
before we get there, Louis, last week I recommended to you Vampire Weekend's first album, self-titled Vampire Weekend. Vampire Weekend was a 2008 album. It was their, obviously, breakout album. They've now had, up until recently, 4 albums released. So with that, Louis, I will hand it over to you.
Would you like to explain what was the last thing from this band that you rec to me? I think that's important, right?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, last time Stephen recommended to me Modern Vampires of the City. I don't remember what episode. It wasn't too long ago. And, you know, one thing I think that was pretty good about this re-rec here is that Modern Vampires of the City, and Stephen didn't know this at the time, but it was an album I'd already heard, and it was also my only Vampire Weekend album. And, you know, whether I had heard it beforehand or not is kind of irrelevant. Really, I think going back to this album showed me that, you know, that album is a little bit of a misleading album for what this band's sound is, I think, if you're, like, just getting into them. Like, it's a good starter album in the sense that it's a good album, but does it really reflect Vampire Weekend sound? I mean, only kind of. You know, listening to this album and from other stuff I'm familiar with from the band as well, like outside of Modern Vampires, you know, Modern Vampires is a very matured version of, I think, the Vampire Weekend sound. I mean, there's a similarity, but this album in comparison, and you know, it only came out, 5 years before, but it's so immature in comparison to Modern Vampires of the City. And, you know, I think that's probably its biggest quality too, is it has that immaturity and kind of wears it on its sleeve. I mean, despite the fact that I think Vampire Weekend is kind of like, they had this like Ivy League, like preppy boy hipster image. I don't really think the sound of the album reflects that. At least maybe it did at the time, or maybe it made sense at the time, but I'm not getting those vibes from this. I got those vibes from the other album. I'm definitely not getting them from this. This is like a super playful, kind of goofy, and extremely breezy indie pop record here. That I guess, it didn't necessarily catch me off guard, but it's certainly interesting going back in their discography after having heard what I think, I mean, I don't know about Father the Bride now, but what I think up to that point anyway was their most mature statement.
Yeah, and I think that we had talked about this last time a little bit. But what I think is interesting about Vampire Weekend in at least their first three album is that there was a very clear arc of immaturity to maturity, where Contra kind of bridged this gap. You could tell that they were really coming into their own in a certain sound, but a lot of the tracks still felt very Vampire Weekend, as in the album Vampire Weekend, whereas the last one we talked about, Modern Vampires of the City, and I think I had mentioned at the time, was a much more mature album. This feels like, to me, every time I listen to it, and partially because, I mean, it's very clear that this is where they were at the time, but this feels very much like a college campus preppy sound album versus a Modern Vampires of the City, and now even their most recent album is a very mature, introspective, reflective album.
See, it's just really funny that you say that because, and I understand the idea behind Vampire Weekend, like as an image at this time, was that they were this like preppy collegiate Ivy League. That's what I kept seeing, Ivy League. But the weird thing is, and again, maybe I don't know why this is, and maybe I'm just missing something that other people are seeing, I guess, but it doesn't really feel that way to me. It really doesn't. I mean, lyrically, maybe a little bit. And of course, there is literally a song called Campus that speaks of being on a university campus. But this album sounds like even more youthful than that. And it sounds like really playful and goofy. And of course, when it wants to be something else and it wants to take itself a bit more seriously, it does. I'm not saying this sounds like the goofiest, most like absurdist shit you can imagine or something like that. But it has that quality to it, which I guess I wasn't expecting here. Yeah, so I mean, if you guys will remember, like, Modern Vampires of the City, I thought was a solid record, but like it doesn't really, that album doesn't really blow me away on any level. It's breezy and it's nice and it has a nice regal sound to it. I think the production's is very good, and I think the songs are pretty good. Like it's a good record. I just doesn't blow me away by any means. And I can say that, my assumption at that point was it was probably their best album, and maybe Vampire Weekend just like wasn't super for me. And this self-titled record, it didn't confirm that that's their best album because I haven't heard the other ones, but it certainly added more evidence to that theory, because this album is like, it's really breezy and it's really nice. But I
want to stop there though, because I think this feels to me, Lewis, more like a matter of perspective, right? Because I think that if you're looking for that maturity, then I think hands down, no question, you would probably go to Modern Vampires of the City and say that's the best album in their disc collection.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that, but my criticism isn't about it has nothing to do with maturity. I wasn't mentioning that as a criticism. I think immaturity is perfectly acceptable in music. One of my favorite albums is Green Day's Dookie, okay? Like, I'm very okay with immaturity. But my problem with this album, and it's not even really a problem so much as it is a reservation, I guess you could say, is just that it's like, yeah, it's a collection of breezy songs. It's a nice breezy 34 minutes, concise record, but nothing here stands to me as being really all that great. Modern Vampires doesn't just have maturity over this. Of course, that's what separates it from this, I think. But Modern Vampires has better songwriting, more lavish production, and just more creativity. Like, a lot of the songs here utilize the same sort of twangy acoustic guitar, which is pretty stereotypical of indie music. However, it doesn't really come to define some of the best albums I think of in indie music. Like, it's usually the weaker, less satisfactory, and less recognizable indie bands who all kind of blend together. And I'm not accusing Vampire Weekend of being one of those, because I do think they stand out from that crowd. But to me, they share that sonic similarity that makes this, like, you know, a breezy indie album with some character. And that's kind of how I feel about it. Like, as far as standout tracks and weaker tracks, the album isn't completely 100% consistent. Like, I do think some songs are better than others. Walcott was my favorite song here. And stuff like A-Punk and stuff are like, they're kind of bops. But like the weaker stuff here, it just really, like, I don't know. Some of the parts of this album just kind of drag for me. Like, I feel like, whatever the name of that one song is, Cape Cod something, just is a really dull tune at its core. And same thing with M79 and Bryn. Like, some of these songs are just very, I don't know, they feel like they lack substance. And yeah, I don't want to keep going, but yeah.
So I think I'm gonna spoil my final score on this one, because this album is easily within my top 5 albums of all time. I think that there's some, and if I 100%, it's nostalgia, first of all. I think that this hit at just like the perfect time, and then it's also what I just mentioned. This hit at just the right time for me, where this really changed my perspective on what I like from music. I think ultimately, I would say I definitely agree. There are some weaker tracks on here, but Ezra's vocals are great on all of these songs. I really like the very pop-minded, pop-centric guitar riffs that you have here. A lot of the just flow of all of these tracks. There's just something about this album that really speaks to me. And it's hard to say how I even would stack this up against their other ones, because I have really enjoyed everything that this band has. I mean, this is my favorite band of all time, so there's that too. But like, I think that for me, what's interesting is, like, every time I go back to this one, I'm reminded of how much I enjoy it. And then I'll go to the next one, reminded of how much I enjoy that one. And that one becomes my new favorite. So they're always in flux. But what I really like about this breakout album for them is that it really is that, you know, everything that you mentioned, super breezy. All of these could easily be on the pop charts, honestly. And a lot of them charted on like alt rock stations, but a lot of these, I think that this really definitely defined the late 2000s, because so many of these songs were in so many films from the late 2000s too, especially A-Punk. That showed up everywhere.
Yeah, I had somebody tell me that Vampire Weekend reminds them of a Wes Anderson film, which is pretty funny, because I think that the styles here are actually kind of similar. It's almost like the sonic equivalent, you know?
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
Yeah. You know, I feel like, so here's the thing, right? And I really appreciate, and actually I'm not, you know, there are some albums that if I was feeling at this level about them, I would want to like argue with you about it and have fun for the show's sake. But the thing is, like, let me say this about this album. You know, and I think I don't really see much in this, to be honest, but it's the kind of album where, like, I acknowledge for sure that for this time period of indie music, Vampire Weekend obviously did something for somebody. I mean, you get these indie bands who come around every now and again who are of this oeuvre. And again, I am not, when I say that, I don't mean that this is as weak or something like that. I just mean I think it comes out of the same kind of idea of indie. There are other bands that come out of this oeuvre who pop up and go away like that. You know, like bands who come up and, like, they make a song, they make like some dumb fucking indie song with like that acoustic guitar, you know, a nice twangy acoustic guitar and like some like boyish singer, and just produce.
But I'm I'm going to compare them to like because this is what I think of when I hear that, and it all was in the same time frame, like a Pumped Up Kicks. You remember that song?
Oh
Pumped
yeah,
Up Kicks,
yeah.
right? But I think what's different to me about Vampire Weekend is one, first of all, these they have a lot of really great tracks on this album, but two, I think that Ezra has always had something to say, and he continues to find that voice. And while this one is, as you mentioned, probably the least mature and really they're really just kind of super flowy songs. I mean, honestly, they probably got in the studio and were like, "Oh, that sounds really good," because like, what's a Cape Cod Kwassa Kwassa? I don't know.
Yeah.
And they like talk about Paul Simon and stuff. It's like just
And Peter
random.
Gabriel
And
too.
Peter Gabriel, yeah, it's like random nonsense,
Yeah.
right?
Well, some of the
But
lyrics had meaning. I read them. They were talking about some like social. They talked about colonialism a lot on this album.
But that's the thing, right? So that
Yeah.
they even at this point, even when they were their most basic, they still clearly had a message and a voice and a very clear voice that I think is missing from something like a Pumped Up Kicks, which is just clearly an indie song that's just trying to be out there on the
Or
radio.
what's that well, Pumped Up Kicks was like a yeah. Or what's that fucking what's that awful fucking indie band that had that song, that Heyo song or whatever? Oh god, I can't remember. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, the Lumineers, but
Oh
that's
my
different.
God. Okay, the Lumineers is more in the Mumford and Sons like camp of
Yeah,
indie.
that's
But I all I'm saying is like I think of these indie bands from this era who I found it really blend together and make really boring breezy songs that had nothing to them. No, fun is way worse.
This is completely a tangent, but speaking of the Lumineers, I remember the year the Lumineers, because they won a Grammy, I want to say, for like Best New Artist
I
or something,
hope they
and they
did.
literally only had the one song.
Yeah.
And that year, I saw, I very clearly remember this. I saw that they had a concert, and they were trying to fill up like a stadium. Not like, oh, you're kind of just standing room only where you probably would expect them to be. No, like a full stadium.
Yeah, and I mean like and let's not mince words here either. The one song that they had was just terrible. Like this band, oh my lord. Anyway, the point is, yeah, I agree. They're from a different camp, but my point is, what I'm trying to say is that I don't, I can't hate this like I can hate Pap like that. I can't. And at the same time, I also think that like I think Vampire Weekend is an eminently hateable band in the sense that I would bet you that there is a large camp of people who fucking hate Vampire Weekend. And I don't even know that there is. I'm just wagering there probably is, because the sound, especially that they provide on this album, I didn't hate it, but I was listening to it and I'm like, this is really hateable. Like I could totally imagine people hearing this and being like, this fucking sucks. Like the Ezra's voice. I mean, the twangy kind of goofy sounding songs. I mean, like I just bet this has a fucking huge hater crowd.
Oh yeah, I mean even down to how like kind of pompous the album art is.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh yeah. And I bet you it exists. And I'll tell you what, like I can't put myself there. Like I feel like Vampire Weekend has something and I can't put my finger on what, because when I listen to this, I don't get much out of it. I find this to be pretty bland, to be honest with you, with some okay songwriting here or there. But like I can't put my finger on what it is, but I feel like this band just has something more than some of the other bands I associate with them. And so I can totally give them credit for that. But I will say that it seems to me, and I mean, I wouldn't be like completely unwilling to check out Contra or the new album, I guess. But like, it seems to me that it's probably pretty likely Modern Vampires is going to end up being my favorite from this band. And I just view that as a solid record, right? But like, I'll give them credit. Like, I think they're a little bit above the punch from who I think they're like. I remember somebody on my server argued that they're even more bland than One Republic. And that just made me realize how much a cut above the rest they actually are. Because I was like, that is one of the craziest things I've ever heard. You're in here. I'm calling you out, buddy. I see you in the chat. You know that was bullshit. And I don't even really like this band. But anyway. But yeah, like, anyway, I feel like I've said my piece mostly. We can get on to the final thoughts so I can be a little bit more clear, because I feel like I'm being a little vague. If we wouldn't mind, unless you have something else to say.
yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So final thoughts. Like I said, to me, this is a nice, concise 34-minute listen, and it does flow really well, I will say that. But a lot of that is just because all the songs are tonally remarkably similar. And I don't really have a problem with an album being samey necessarily. And also, I do think the songs have variety. But I actually think it works to this album's benefit in some ways because it feels even shorter than it is, and it's pretty short. I can see why Steven would really love this, especially if it connected with you at the right time, because it's clearly such a re-listenable album that you can just put on and listen to and finish. But at the same time, like, I don't see anything in this really beyond that. I mean, I think there are some pretty fun little upbeat songs. It's a breezy album. It's a nice indie pop album. There's some okay songwriting, some okay hooks. Ezra's vocals are pretty solid. The only song that I thought to be really fucking annoying was One. Blake's Got a New Face. That song, ooh man, that hurt me. But other than that, like, I admire it in some way. I think it's a nice indie pop album. I can see why somebody would really like it. I'm gonna give it a 6. So that's just 1 point below what I gave Modern Vampires, but it's a more positive 6 than a negative 6. Some 6s are like, man, this had so much more potential that it didn't capitalize on. And other 6s are like, that was nice. And that's kind of what this one is for me. So would I recommend this? Not really. Yeah, not really. But I mean, I guess it depends on if my description sounded good to you, I guess. Then, sure.
And I still really, really enjoy this thing. I think up and down, I like the production quality. I like the catchiness of all these songs because they are very catchy. Ezra's vocals I've always enjoyed. I think that this thing is just so easily listenable. As you mentioned, it's like 34 minutes and you can put it on and then it's like basically over and you're like, oh, nice. And then you can listen to it again if you'd like. But unfortunately, I have to give it a 9. It's not a 10 because it's not One Republic.
Nice. I appreciate that. Anyway, yeah, we're repping our boys One Republic out there, okay? They're doing a good job, okay? Give them credit. Come on. Anyway.
Look, they're not called Two Republic for a reason because there's only one of them. So.
Exactly. Okay. I think we should move on to what I recommended you, Steven. Are you ready? Of this segment, to be honest with you. However,
and so that was our show, everyone. Thank you for watching.
Go listen to A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Anyway, yeah. So that's what I recommended to Steven, and I recommended it to him to be one of my garbage recs. The point of the show is to recommend anything, whether it's good or bad, as long as we've seen it and want the other person to react to it in some way. So that was my choice. But on second thought, I was like, did I really just recommend an album from like my second favorite band, or maybe my favorite band to Steven, and I recommended him their worst album, and I felt kind of bad about it. So when I was thinking back to what to do for RE-RECC, I was like, this is the kind of thing where I want to do something else. Now, I remember specifically, Steven, you saying in that Momentary Lapse episode, you said that you weren't really that big into Pink Floyd, that you basically respected them more than you enjoyed their music. Like you said, they obviously had, if I remember correctly, you said they obviously had some good albums, like Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall and whatever, but like, they just weren't really for you. And I figured, well, I could give him Dark Side of the Moon. I could give him something like that, but like, you probably already heard that. But I assumed, and you can correct me if I was wrong, I assumed you have not heard Animals or anything off of it. So I wanted to throw you a curveball with, I shouldn't spoil that just yet, but yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Have you heard this before? Have you heard the songs? Have you heard of this artist before? Lewis recommended me this album. I've not heard of this artist before. Pink Floyd, Yeah,
well, what's interesting is I actually have short-term memory loss. So even though I listened to Pink Floyd's last album, I had never heard of this band. So that was kind of an exciting adventure for me. But yes, Lewis, I have heard this album before, actually.
Ooh.
So what's interesting is, I still, I'll just get this out of the way. Like, I still would say I feel largely the same way about them. Just for whatever, like, I enjoy them, but they're not a band that I'll put on any regular cadence. And exactly, we have a listener here in the chat who said I had a momentary lapse of reason. That's true.
Nice.
After listening to that album, pretty much everyone better have a momentary lapse of reason because the album is garbage. But this album, like I said, I still enjoy them. Every time I put Pink Floyd on, besides that album, every other major album
That's
that
a
I put
masterpiece, Steven. I am upset.
Well, it's such a masterpiece that I can only listen to it once,
Okay.
and it's like, okay, now it's in the Hall of Fame. Every other album that I put on by Pink Floyd, I've always enjoyed, but I don't know, just something about it. But enough about that. Talking about this album, what's interesting to me about this album actually is that it is also very short. Like ultimate, but maybe that's just because Lewis, very lately you've been recommending to me albums that are like 7 hours long.
So, yeah.
So
To Be Kind, the famous 7-hour album.
yeah. So in comparison, 40 minutes is like, ooh,
Sure.
I have tons of 40 minutes to kill. Um, so I think what I really enjoyed most about this album is the production. Obviously, Roger Waters is still great vocally on this thing. Geez, God, the guitar riffs up and down this album are just like, and that's the thing that I've always enjoyed the most about Pink Floyd, honestly, is
David fucking Gilmour, man.
is David Gilmour on the guitar.
fucking
It's just
Gilmour.
insane sometimes, especially like in Dogs. It's just ridiculous.
His
Um,
guitar solos just. You will never hear a guitar solo that will move you in the way a Gilmour solo will. You just won't. Like,
Yeah.
I haven't.
yeah, and honestly, like if this album was just that, I would have been like, holy God. But then there's all the stuff around it too, which is incredibly amazing. The concept. I want to ask you something, Lewis, before we keep going here. So I know it's a concept album, and the concept here really is centered around, like some political stance. And would you consider this to be a protest album?
Yes, I
Because
absolutely
it kind of is, right?
I absolutely would.
So would you call this a concept and a protest album?
Sure. I on that point, you have to remember to the time period and the place that this came from. In 1970, this is a direct response to Thatcherism, which, am I mistaken, or did we talk about something else that was also a response to Thatcherism? Or am I just getting weird deja vu right now? But for some reason, I feel like we did. Maybe it'll come to me.
What about that one lady who had that album that like the
PJ
cover
Harvey?
art was,
Yeah, that wasn't about Margaret Thatcher, but it was a British protest. Maybe I'm just thinking of that. Whatever. PJ Harvey, that one lady. But anyway,
that one lady.
But yeah, and so yes, I do think, and actually,
You don't know. Maybe Margaret Thatcher was in the war she was talking about.
she fought on the front lines.
Yeah, she fought on the front lines.
But when we, I think something that's really essential to note here that I do think makes this a protest album is, and you may or may not have caught it, but on the song "Pigs," the 3 verses reference actual political figures, and in fact, in this, is it the third verse? It's the third verse. He references specifically Mary Whitehouse. So if that doesn't make it a protest album, I don't know what does. Like referencing a politician who's currently in office by name, So yeah.
I think that what's really great about this album, Pigs on the Wing Part 1, Pigs on the Wing Part 2, I love how this album is kind of a circular album. It opens and closes very similarly. That I really enjoyed. Even these longer tracks like Dogs, it's just such an amazing journey from start to finish. I think something that I often mention as we talk about music that have longer tracks is how bored I get through them because my attention span is low.
Yeah,
because
you got
I'm
bored during Bring the Sun to St. Louver tour, which I'll be sure to bring up many more times throughout our
Because
podcast. Yeah.
because I'm a millennial.
Mm.
And it's like, this song isn't an app on my phone. So wow.
Millennials.
But all of these longer tracks, you don't even feel it, honestly. And really, ultimately, like this whole album is just like one continuous thing. So it's like they all kind of blend anyway. Not blend in that like I can't separate them, but blend in that they just very naturally flow into one another.
Yeah, it feels like one piece. Yeah.
So it just feels like one piece. So it's kind of like, well, you don't really even notice. But like listening to them track by track, all the longer tracks, I just really enjoy. And each individual track I found has a very nice arc in its production and the lyrics and all of the musicality. And then obviously across the whole album, there's a very nice arc in the same way. I think what's interesting about this concept album is that this has been the I feel like even the musicality here really spoke to me. Like I feel the concept even in the musicality, not as much as, and I'm going to go back to the PJ Harvey album because that also was something that was like a big protest album. I don't know if I would you consider it a concept album,
Oh yeah,
kinda,
yeah,
right?
it was, yeah.
Not necessarily to that degree, because I really felt like every single track there, I felt it from the lyrics to the score to everything. But on this album as well, I feel that pretty much from every track too.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you know, when people think of Pink Floyd concept albums, I think, or at least probably when most people do, the first thing that's going to come to your mind is The Wall, because The Wall's a big double album. It's a story album, and let's be real here, all of their biggest hits that everybody
It's a
knows.
movie.
Oh yeah, it is a movie too, and all their biggest hits that everybody knows are on The Wall, pretty much. So that's obviously where people go. But the thing about Animals is this is the Wall is the sprawling double album, with all this insane transitional material and all this kind of stuff on there. This album is a concise 3 songs. I mean, yes, there's Pigs in the Wing, which is additional 2 songs, but it's 3 songs. It's dogs, pigs, and sheep. That's the core of this album, and then it's bookended by the other 2 songs. And I mean, it is remarkable how much they are able to get out of this concept with only 3 songs in 40 minutes. It's insane. And I think the reason it's so impressive to me is that Roger Waters, he really was the mastermind behind this record in the conceptual department anyway. He crafted this brilliant narrative arc that that just allows him to speak volumes about everything that needs to be said on this topic. You have the ruthless businessmen, the dogs, the politicians, the pigs, and then the mass public, the sheep. And that's all you need, because you can cover every single kind of social commentary and criticism that can be directed towards the crony capitalist, just capitalist system that Margaret Thatcher is famous for. And I mean, it's so biting. Like, the song Pigs is truly just one of the most snarky and what's the word I'm looking for? Like, we'll just go with snarky, but it's like it makes a mockery of the politicians. There is absolutely it treats them like people who should just be ashamed of their existence. Like, if you read these lyrics, Roger Waters' lyrics here are just so incredibly mean-spirited, and there's a good reason for that, because I think in the first song where he talks about these businessmen, which I think is where a lot of people would be quick to place so much blame, he does place a lot of blame. He paints them out to be these ruthless, conniving, inhumane assholes. But at the same time, he's actually sympathetic for them. There's a line in here about how you're just another saddled man all alone and dying of cancer. Like, in the end, this businessman who's lived his life punching his way to the top and leaving everyone behind in the dust, and exploiting everyone and treating humanity like a game, at the end of the day, is the same kind of sad person, victim to the system that everybody else is a victim to. And I think the thing that astonishes me about this album, more and more as I listen to it now, because I've heard this thing, God, I've been over 100 times at this point, probably maybe even around 200. I've listened to this thing so much. And what gets to me now is just how much of just a literary masterpiece it is lyrically. Like, Pink Floyd has great lyrics generally across the board, but this album just takes it to a whole nother level. I mean, not only with the narrative structure, but the absolutely brilliant final passage of Dogs, where Roger Waters highlights all of the ways in which the businessmen think of everybody else as ruthless individuals who can't do this or whatever, that the final coda section, and finishing it off with who was dragged down by the stone, which is a concept kind of throughout the record, the idea of the stone, which of course is the system dragging everybody under. I mean, my God, this thing is, it's fucking brilliant. I talked for a long time. Say something.
Lewis, this is a almost complete non sequitur, but one thing that this page suggests is that this album is a response to the punk rock movement.
It's been said that way, yeah. Yeah.
But in what capacity? Like, what regard?
So one of the things that punk rock responded to was progressive rock. And because, I mean, again, these were around the same era in the UK, right? I mean, punk spawned in a multitude of places, but and the kind of ridiculous bombast and, you know, all the crazy shit you associate with progressive rock bands. And of course, Pink Floyd is a progressive rock band. And what a lot of punk bands were doing was this kind of rebellious political nature. You think of the Sex Pistols and other bands from around this era. And yeah, in that sense, the album, when it says that, it doesn't mean that the album is a punk album or takes influence from punk. I mean, it does lyrically, but it's that, you know, they turned their prog sensibilities into a harsher, more biting direction similar to punk rock. And if you compare even the production on this record, which is still stellar, if you compare the production of this album to the previous two, Wish You Were Here and Dark Side, it is so much harsher and less pristine than those two albums. Like, in so many ways, this is, I think, a response to punk rock, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, something that you brought up also that I think is worth mentioning again is like, and of course, Gilmour's guitar playing all over this record is insane, but the solos on this thing are just breathtaking. I mean, the two solos in Dogs are just two of the greatest guitar solos ever fucking recorded. Like this, I mean...
Oh yeah, easily. And if I think if someone were to listen to this and say, that was okay, I'd be like, what did you just listen to?
Yeah, I know. Or take the solo in Pigs where he makes his guitar sound like a squealing pig. It is so awesome. I mean, God. And then there's the final solo in that song. It's just astonishing. Another thing you brought up I wanted to touch on here is you brought up how each song has an arc to it. And that is 100% correct. I mean, these songs each have their individually like amazing intros, obviously fantastic stuff, interplay throughout the song, break sections, solos, all this crazy shit, and then they all round out with a coda that makes that entire song feel worth it. You think of the final moments on Dogs, the who was this, who was that bit, which is an astonishing finale to that song. The finale to Pigs where Gilmour just rips a final solo that is insane. I didn't say punk rock had a connection to art rock. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't say that. And then on top of that, like, at the finale to Sheep. Oh my God. Like, wow. It's just mind-blowing. It's got one of the biggest and most incredible finishes to any song. And it's such a simple chord progression, but it sounds incredible. And I mean, it truly makes the finale of this album feel like a real like journey that you've actually reached a destination, you know? And maybe that's why also you didn't feel like you could be bored by these songs, because they all take you on such a journey. But the important thing is that they finish you off in a place where you really feel like it was worth actually going every step that you took.
And even the more muted stuff is so classically Pink Floyd to me. Like, you know, the very intro of this album, the way that it kind of rounds out on Pigs Part 1 and Part 2, even that lighter fare, that, you know, not the big grand guitar solos, just the very rhythmically inclined guitar that they have within these albums is incredible as well.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, instrumentally, they're just on point. I mean, and you know, everybody gets places to shine here. Like, the bass on Moments of Pigs is insanely good. I think of the intro to Pigs where you get Richard Wright's keyboard, and then like that bass line comes in, and it just like wraps around the keyboard. It's like, It's amazing. The keyboard work, like the keyboard solo in Dogs, which is this incredibly subdued section that, you know, not much really happens, but as it builds and this solo just begins to envelop the listener, it's really astonishing. And I mean, we already talked about the guitar work, which is just incredible. Another thing as well, I think the actual structure of the record is just brilliant. Like, this thing is an album that constantly ramps up in intensity, right? Dogs is the most mellow of the three main songs here. Pigs picks that up a notch. It rocks a lot harder. There's a lot more prominent harsh guitars in it. And some really intense soloing, and then Sheep just kicks the door down. I mean, it just amps this album's like energy up to fucking 11. And I just think it was really smart how they constantly ramp up that intensity and energy. And again, it plays into the concept pretty well too, as the Sheep eventually like revolt and kill the dogs, as happens at the end. But as these events are bubbling up to the surface, the album is gaining intensity and energy as well. It's really incredible. And then Pigs on the Wing does a good job of calming you between those moments, reminding you that maybe things are going to be okay. Whereas the rest of this album is telling you things are not okay. Things are not okay. You know, so it gives you some reprise. And I just adore it.
I think that we could gush about this for a long time. So maybe we kind of wrap it up, give our final thoughts.
Yeah, all right, go ahead.
So Up and Down, this thing is really incredible. And I think that we just talked about all the main reasons, but for me, it's vocally, it's lyrically, it's all the musicality displayed within this. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed all the individual arcs from track to track, but then the overarching arc of the entire album. It's only 40 minutes. It really grips you. Lewis, you mentioned that those individual arcs really kind of have you hanging on, and there's a nice rising action. There's a nice lead off as you go into track to track, and I think that's what really helps this thing. I give this also a 9 today, so 2 9s. I think the only reason for me why it's not a 10 is, as I mentioned, it's one of those where, gosh, I really like the experience, but it's just one of those where, for whatever reason, me and Pink Floyd have never fully gelled. It's not something that I think I would go back to. I enjoyed the experience, and I like listening to Pink Floyd every now and then, but there's still just that one little something that doesn't push it over the edge. I think everything David Gilmour does on this album is 100% a 10 out of 10. So if I think that like that alone maybe pushes it more to like the 9.5, but I like to give usually kind of the clean whole numbers. I would definitely recommend this album to anyone, though, for sure.
Yeah. Something funny that's been going on here, Steven, is we're 31 episodes into Get Recc'd, and I have recommended you all 3 of my top 3 favorite albums, which I didn't realize until a little while ago when I was like, hey, we've just touched on my top 3. That's interesting. If you remember my favorite album of all time, In the Airplane Over the Sea, I wrecked to him a while back. And just in these last 2 episodes, I rounded it out. To Be Kind's my 3rd favorite album, and this is sitting right there in that 2nd spot. You know, Pink Floyd, I mean, for starters, like, the streak that they hit in the 70s is practically unmatched. Like, when you think about what they made, I mean, they had a streak of Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. Like, holy shit. Like, how many bands could ever dream of nailing that level of consistency with 4 albums in a row? I mean, that's astonishing. And to me, Animals is their best record. Like, and yes, Dark Side sits at my number 2 spot, but Animals, I mean, man, like, not only is this their tightest and most fully realized concept, musically, this is insane. Like, you mentioned that Gilmour gets a 10 on this thing. Gilmour gets a 13 on this thing, okay? Like, wow, this is just truly some of, if not the greatest guitar work across an album that I've ever heard. It's remarkable. The concept is insanely good. The lyrics are poignant, biting, and they still hold water today. This thing has not lost a shred of potency, legitimacy, or credibility. Like, this the concept, the idea, and the things that they were talking about on this album apply just as much, if not more, to the state that these countries live in today. I mean, whether it's the U.S. or the U.K., whatever. Maybe not the U.K., I guess. And in that sense, like, it really does remain this kind of timeless album that maybe one day could be looked at as like a historical icon of how things were at the time, but at least for now, it still means something. Of course this is a 10. I mean, this is just track to track, second to second, just some of the greatest music that has ever been made. And I have no problem with the band just not personally gelling for you. I really don't. I think 10 should be personal, and I get it. That's fine. But if we're talking musically, like this thing, musically, lyrically, everything, flow-wise, this thing is just perfect. It is a perfect record. I have no problems with it. And even a lot of the albums I would give a 10, I couldn't really say that. Like, this is truly perfect. And yeah, so would I recommend this? Of course not. It fucking sucks. Why would you listen to this shit? Dumb dad rock. Garbage. Anyway, yes, I recommend it.
Get this dinosaur rock out of here.
Dinosaur. Give me my Imagine Dragons, mom. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, where's One Republic? Am I right?
One Republic! I stand them so much. Okay.
Okay, so looks like it's my recommendation now.
RE-RECC, everybody. Just keep in mind. So today, obviously they should remember, but we are doing the final episode of RE-RECC. So the recommendations that Steve and I are going to be giving you here are callbacks, continuations from, or any other sort of a rec we've previously given in the past, which means, Stephen, make sure that you kind of give that context. But yeah, go ahead.
So, Lewis, I am going to recommend you a film from a director and writer that I have recommended you something before. That film was the great, the one, the only Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets.
What the fuck are you doing?
My favorite movie of all time, Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. Now, I went back and forth, Lewis, of which Luc Besson movie to give you. I think ultimately I decided I was going to stay in a very similar sci-fi genre and one that might be, I don't know, kind of controversial. So I'm going to give you, Lewis, The Fifth Element by Luc Besson. This was a 1997 film, mainly starring Bruce Willis and Mila Jovovich, who I feel like doesn't even exist anymore. When was the last time you've heard Mila Jovovich?
When was the first time I've heard that? Sorry, go on.
Just now.
Yeah, it was. Okay.
So, Lewis, my recommendation to you, 1997's The Fifth Element.
Okay. So, great. Well, I'm glad you gave me something that was a bit dickish, although it seems like you're being on the nicer end of the spectrum because I know that.
Yeah, I'm gonna be frankly honest with you, Lewis. I wanted to give you something else by Limp Bizkit, but I couldn't listen to another Limp.
Cheating. That would have been cheating because it wasn't your rec. It wasn't your rec.
I know.
You dodged a bullet, Steven. That wasn't your rec. Okay.
I know. That's what I realized, so that's why I didn't do it.
That would have been so fucked. God damn it. Chocolate Starfish. I just got reminded that I listened to that for this show. Audience recommendation, I gotta say, man, the likelihood of that happening again, pretty low. Anyway. Okay. Right. So, to give a little bit of context here, when it came to doing RE-RECC, and I really wanted to do this little trilogy here because I thought, going back and looking at some of the recommendations that I'd given Steven early on in this show, and even kind of throughout it, I guess, a lot of my thought process was always like, I want to get a reaction out of him of some sort. It didn't really matter if what I was giving him was like bad or good, but it was always just like, I really want to get that reaction out of him. It wasn't really about the discussion a lot of the time, like the fact that I recommended you a Swans album and it was filth. The fact that I recommended you, Trout Mask Replica as our first recommendation, which I'd give that to anybody, but still, it was pretty obvious that's what I was doing. And so I was like, when I realized that kind of later on, I was like, man, I really wish that I could have shown Steven some of the better stuff from these bands. Like, yeah, I really like Filth, but it's not a starter album, and I knew he wasn't going to like it. So I was like, man, I should show Steven a better album by like my favorite band, right? that was kind of the thing going into this, and I always wanted to make sure that not only was I covering a base, not only was I covering one of those bases, but something that maybe was even more important is I wanted to make sure I made Steven go back to something that I knew he wouldn't have otherwise. Like when he said that he really wasn't into Pink Floyd, I was like, well, he's probably not going to go check out more Pink Floyd albums. And when he said like, or with Filth that he hated it so much, why the hell would you ever want to listen to more Swans after hearing Filth and just thinking it was a bunch of noise, you know? So that was kind of my thought process going into a lot of this. But the funny thing is, Steven, and I realized that you actually did my work for me, because of all 30 episodes leading up to RE-REC'd, or I guess 29, there was only one thing that Steven specifically said he wasn't going to go back to. And I was like, oh man. And so Steven, I'm going to be a dick and force you to go back to something you said you were going to avoid. Steven, I am recommending you 4 more episodes of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. I'm giving you specifically Suited for Success, Pinky Pride, The Cutie Map, and Amending Fences. And that does it for today. You know, I really wish you gave me Limp Bizkit, actually, because then I'd feel a little bit better about that. But whatever.
You know, Lewis, just as I reminded you that we listened to Chocolate Starfish, you just reminded me that I had to watch My Little Pony. In fact, I have so wanted to, it's escaped my brain. Like, it doesn't even exist in my consciousness anymore. And now I have to go back to this.
And it's all your fault, buddy. Oh. Anyway. But yeah. Oh, okay. Anyway, sorry.
I even just recently looked at, have you seen that game, Them Fightin' Herds?
Yeah, I played it at my friend's house. You know what? It's actually pretty fun.
Yeah, I heard that. But even when I looked at that, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I remember this used to be a My Little Pony game. I've never watched My Little Pony, because that's how much I've had it out of my head. I've, like, blocked it out of my memory.
Oh, man, that's a real shame. Anyway, okay.
Well.
We do actually have some housekeeping today. And this is not really super important, because I have to be kind of vague, actually, because I haven't really announced anything. But all I want to say is stay tuned and check out other announcements that come out on this channel, because they are going to relate to Get Recc'd pretty hardcore. And I don't want you guys to miss out on that and think that, like, Get Recc'd is over or something. Okay, that's all I'll say for now. Oh, Steven, do you want to announce, I hope you know what I'm talking about, so that you can make it epic, okay? Do you want to announce the amazing new branding decision, the, what the fuck would a business call this? Branching out that our brand has done in the past 2 weeks?
I think I know where you're going with this, but maybe not. So everyone, we are now on a new service.
Yes, we are.
We are on something called Castbox. I don't have the link or anything, but we are on there. If you want to listen back to our podcast, specifically if you want to listen to our podcast, have a version where you can easily download and listen in the car without having to utilize any YouTube streaming or YouTube download. That's a service. It is completely free to listen to our podcast on Castbox. We don't do the live streams on there. It's only old uploads, so only if you want to go back and listen to our amazing vocals, just grace your ears as you're on your morning commute, listening to things like Chocolate Starfish and other great essentials, Valyrian.
Oh, Steven, if they're listening to Chocolate Starfish, I don't know why they'd want to put on Get Recc'd. You know, like, why would you want to turn that off? You know, I mean, that's the perfect drive time commute album.
That's true. If you want to, like, listen to how two people share your feelings about that wonderful grace of an album, then you can listen to our podcast, Get Recc'd.
Yeah, and anyway, this episode, I'll hopefully remember to put it up as soon as we get off. Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned this. Did you mention that there's a Castbox app so you can just have it right on your phone?
Right, there is a Castbox app.
So anytime you want to hear glorious Get Recc'd, of course, you always can. Once again, before we release, just so everyone knows, please stay tuned for announcements on my channel if you like the show. It's going to be pretty important, but I'm not sure when it will come. And other than that, I think that's it. Am I right? Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
well, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get Recc'd.